The Galactic Military Academy floated in the void like a chrome and steel monument to interspecies cooperation, which was honestly the biggest joke anyone had told in the past 3 centuries. Because if there was one thing the galaxy's finest military minds could agree on, it was that they absolutely could not agree on anything, especially when it came to those peculiar little bipeds from the third rock orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Station Nexus Prime hummed with the controlled chaos of 1,000 different species trying not to kill each other during morning drills. The air recyclers worked overtime processing oxygen for humans, methane for the Silthari, and whatever that purple fog was that kept the Zentari from dissolving into puddles of intellectual superiority. It was, by all accounts, a miracle of engineering and diplomacy. Or it would have been if anyone actually wanted it to work. Dakota pushed through the crowded corridor, her regulation boots making satisfying clicks against the polished deck plating. She'd learned early in her academy tenure that confidence was 90% of survival, and the other 10% was knowing which aliens would try to eat you if you showed weakness. The Drakmori, for instance, had that whole pack mentality thing going on. Show fear, and they'd circle you like sharks who'd learned to walk upright and develop a concerning interest in military tactics. "Oi, Doc!" Finn's voice cut through the multilingual chatter with the precision of a sonic drill. "You seen the notice board lately? Our beloved instructors have cooked up something special for us poor little cadets." She turned to find her fellow human approaching with that particular grin that meant trouble was brewing. Finn had the kind of face that looked innocent right up until he started talking, at which point it became clear he was the sort of person who could rewire a starship's navigation system using spare parts from a coffee maker, which he had done twice. "Define special," Dakota said, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "Well, remember how they've been going on about real-world preparedness and testing our limits under extreme stress and all that delightful motivational drivel?" "Unfortunately." Finn's grin widened. "Seems they've decided we need a practical demonstration of survival skills. Something about separating the wheat from the chaff, though I'm not entirely sure they understand that particular metaphor, considering half the species here photosynthesize." Dakota felt that familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same one she'd gotten back on Earth when her recruitment officer had explained that joining the Galactic Military Academy would be a character-building experience, which, in hindsight, should have been her first clue that character building was military speak for systematic psychological trauma with educational benefits. They found Cleo and Juno in the human quarters, a cramped section of the U station that had clearly been designed by someone who'd never met a human but had received a detailed description from their cousin's neighbor's friend. The bunks were too short, the lockers too narrow, and the lighting had that particular quality that made everything look like it was happening inside a migraine. Cleo sat cross-legged on her bunk, staring at her datapad with the kind of intensity she usually reserved for tactical simulations and finding flaws in supposedly foolproof security systems. Her dark hair fell in a curtain around her face, creating a barrier between herself and the rest of the universe that most people had learned not to cross uninvited. Juno, meanwhile, was methodically organizing his medical kit for the 15th time that week. His hands moved with the steady precision of someone who'd learned early that in a crisis, the difference between life and death often came down to finding the right tool in under 3 seconds. He looked up as they entered, brown eyes crinkling with the kind of smile that could calm a panicking patient or a freaking-out teammate with equal effectiveness. "Let me guess," Cleo said without looking up from her datapad. "They're planning something that's going to test our resilience and adaptability, while simultaneously proving that humans don't belong in the big kid's sandbox." Spot on, Finn said, flopping onto his own bunk with theatrical drama. Though I suspect their definition of testing might involve significantly more mortal peril than usual. Juno sealed his medical kit with a soft click. More than the zero-G combat exercises? More than the toxic atmosphere survival course? More than that delightful week we spent learning hand-to-hand combat with the Kelthari, who happened to have natural armor plating and acid for blood? Oh, much more, Dakota said, settling onto her bunk and studying her teammates. 4 humans among hundreds of alien cadets, representing a species that most of the galaxy viewed as either adorably primitive or concerningly unstable, depending on who you asked and how much they'd had to drink. The truth was, humans had only been part of the galactic community for about 50 years, which in cosmic terms was roughly equivalent to 5 minutes. Most species measured their civilizations in millennia or geological epochs. Humans measured theirs in generations and coffee breaks, which gave everyone else the impression that they were either remarkably adaptable or completely insane. The jury was still out on which. "So what's the actual plan?" Cleo asked, finally looking up from her datapad. "And please tell me it doesn't involve any more cultural exchange exercises with species that consider violence a form of artistic expression." Before anyone could answer, the intercom crackled to life with the distinctive voice of Commander Thane. The Vorthak had a voice like grinding stone and a personality to match. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world where the primary forms of recreation were volcanic surfing and philosophical debates that ended in ritual combat. This made him ideally suited for military leadership and absolutely terrible at small talk. All cadets report to Arena Complex Delta for mandatory briefing. Attendance is not optional. Survival gear is recommended, but not provided. That is all. The 4 humans exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective opinion of mandatory briefings that came with survival disclaimers. "Well," Juno said, standing and shouldering his medical kit, "this should be interesting." "That's one word for it," Dakota muttered, but she was already moving. Whatever the Academy had planned, she had a feeling that hesitation would be the first mistake, and quite possibly the last one they'd be allowed to make. The corridor outside their quarters buzzed with nervous energy as cadets from dozens of species made their way toward Arena Complex Delta. Dakota caught fragments of conversation in languages she couldn't pronounce, but the tone was universal. Confusion mixed with apprehension and seasoned with the particular kind of dread that came from being a student in an institution that viewed education and torture as closely related concepts. The Helixians moved in their characteristic formation, crystal-skinned and elegant, communicating through harmonics that sounded like wind chimes having a philosophical discussion. They were followed by a pack of Drachmori, their scaled hides shifting color with emotional states that ranged from aggressive orange to deeply concerned purple. The Quellans brought up the rear, their cybernetic implants glowing softly as they shared data through their neural networks with the efficiency of a hive mind and the personality of a tax audit. "Notice how nobody's talking to us?" Finn observed as they walked. "Can you blame them?" Cleo replied. "We're the species that invented nuclear weapons before we figured out how to properly recycle. From their perspective, we're either too primitive to be useful or too crazy to be safe." "Both assessments are probably accurate," Juno added cheerfully. Dakota had to admit there was some truth to that. Humans had a reputation in the galactic community, and it wasn't entirely flattering. They were known for being unpredictable, emotionally volatile, and possessing a troubling tendency to solve complex problems through the creative application of violence and jury-rigged technology. Other species found this either fascinating or terrifying, with very little middle ground. Arena Complex Delta turned out to be a massive structure that looked like someone had decided to cross a gladiatorial coliseum with a maximum security prison, and then decorated it with the kind of lighting that suggested terrible things were about to happen. The main chamber could easily hold several thousand spectators, though today it was occupied only by the Academy's Cadet Corps and a collection of instructors who looked like they were trying very hard not to smile. Commander Thane stood at the center of the arena floor, his 8-foot frame casting a shadow that seemed to have its own gravitational pull. Beside him, Professor Kelm consulted a datapad with the satisfied expression of someone who was about to reveal a particularly elegant solution to a long-standing problem. "Cadets," Thane's voice boomed across the arena. "You have spent months learning theory, practicing techniques, and participating in exercises designed to prepare you for the realities of military service. Today, we move beyond theory." He gestured to the walls of the arena, which Dakota now noticed were lined with observation windows and what looked suspiciously like blast shielding. "Behind me lies a complete ecosystem, carefully constructed to test every aspect of your training. You will enter in teams of 4 to 6 individuals, representative of the natural unit size for most military operations. Your objective is simple: survive for 48 hours while completing a series of tasks designed to test your tactical thinking, resource management, and ability to function under extreme stress." Professor Kelm stepped forward, her silver skin gleaming under the arena lights. "The environment contains multiple biomes, each presenting unique challenges. You will have access to basic survival equipment, but success will depend primarily on your ability to adapt, cooperate, and overcome obstacles through intelligence and determination." Dakota felt that knot in her stomach tighten. The way Kelm said obstacles suggested they weren't talking about difficult terrain or bad weather. "Questions?" Thane asked, though his tone suggested that questions were neither expected nor particularly welcome. A Drakmori cadet raised one clawed hand. "Commander, what sort of obstacles should we expect?" Thane's smile revealed teeth that could have been mistaken for industrial cutting tools. "The sort that will determine whether you are fit to serve in the galactic military or whether you should consider alternative career paths. Perhaps something in customer service." The arena fell silent. In the galactic community, suggesting someone was only qualified for customer service was roughly equivalent to questioning their right to exist as a sentient being. "Teams will be assigned based on species compatibility and psychological profiles," Professor Kelm announced. "Humans, you will be entering as a single unit." Dakota exchanged glances with her teammates. 4 humans against whatever waited in that carefully constructed ecosystem. She had a feeling that the Academy's definition of species compatibility was going to be tested in ways that nobody had anticipated. "One final note," Thane added, almost as an afterthought. "The ecosystem is self-contained and completely sealed once activated. There will be no outside intervention, no emergency extraction, and no second chances. You succeed, or you face the consequences of failure." The lights dimmed, and hidden machinery hummed to life. Somewhere behind the arena walls, Dakota could hear the sound of massive barriers retracting and systems coming online. Whatever waited for them in there, it was waking up. And she had a feeling it was hungry. The entrance to the biodome opened like the mouth of some cosmic beast that had spent eons perfecting the art of looking absolutely terrifying. The portal itself was a shimmering barrier of energy that distorted the view beyond, giving glimpses of what lay waiting that were somehow worse than complete darkness would have been. Through the wavering field, Dakota caught flashes of twisted trees, unnatural shadows, and the kind of lighting that suggested nature had been having a really bad day when this place was designed. "Well," Finn said, adjusting the straps of his equipment pack, "that's not ominous at all. I particularly enjoy how they've managed to make an artificial ecosystem look like it was designed by someone who really, really hates the concept of life." The four humans stood at the threshold while other teams made their final preparations. The Helixians had formed their characteristic geometric pattern, their crystal bodies refracting light in ways that created rainbow patterns on the arena floor. They communicated through those haunting harmonic frequencies, and Dakota could swear she caught notes of what sounded like confidence mixed with anticipation. The Drakmori pack clustered together, their scaled hides shifting through spectrums of color that spoke of excitement and predatory hunger. Their leader, Krath, stood nearly 8 feet tall with muscles that moved like liquid steel under his natural armor. His team moved with the fluid coordination of born hunters, each individual perfectly aware of their packmates' positions and intentions. The Quellans were, as always, unsettling in their mechanical efficiency. Their cybernetic implants glowed steadily as they shared tactical data through their neural networks, creating a collective intelligence that could process information faster than most species could think. Nex, their apparent leader, had replaced so much of her original biology with technology that she looked more like a very sophisticated robot than a living being. "Right then," Cleo said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she'd finished analyzing a situation and reached conclusions that nobody else was going to like. "Anyone else notice how the other teams are treating this like a routine training exercise?" "You mean the complete lack of existential dread?" Juno asked, checking his medical supplies one final time. "The absence of that little voice in the back of their heads screaming that something is very, very wrong here." "Exactly that, yes." Dakota studied the other teams more carefully. Cleo was right. The alien cadets showed normal pre-exercise nerves, the kind of tension that came from wanting to perform well and avoid embarrassment. But there was something else missing, something that every human in the galaxy developed by the age of 5, the ability to sense when adults were lying to you about how dangerous something was going to be. "They don't see it," she realized. "They're taking this at face value, a survival exercise with some challenging obstacles. While we're standing here feeling like we're about to be fed to something that considers sentient beings a light snack," Finn added. "Question is, are we being paranoid, or are they being naive?" Professor Kelm's voice echoed through the arena. "Teams will enter at 30-second intervals. Helixians, you're first." The crystal-skinned beings moved forward with ethereal grace, their forms seeming to flow through the energy barrier like light passing through water. They emerged on the other side looking remarkably composed, for people who had just stepped into what appeared to be a fever dream designed by a committee of sadists. "Drakmori, you're next." Krath's pack approached the portal with predatory confidence, their scales rippling through shades of anticipation and challenge hunger. They passed through the barrier like they owned the place, disappearing into the twisted landscape beyond with the kind of swagger that came from being apex predators on their home world. Quellans. Nex and her team processed through the entrance with mechanical precision, their cybernetic enhancements adapting to the environmental conditions before they'd even fully materialized on the other side. Dakota watched their implants shift from blue to amber, indicating some kind of threat assessment protocol had activated. That was when she knew for certain that her paranoia was justified. "Humans, you're up." The four of them approached the energy barrier, and Dakota felt the air around them change. There was a taste to it now, metallic and organic at the same time, like blood mixed with ozone and the particular smell that came right before a thunderstorm. Her skin prickled with electricity that had nothing to do with the portal's energy field. "Remember," she said quietly, "whatever happens in there, we stick together. We watch each other's backs. We think before we act, and we assume that everything wants to kill us until proven otherwise." "Standard human protocol, then," Finn said with a grin that was only slightly forced. They stepped through the barrier. The biodome was massive, easily the size of a small city, with a dome ceiling that projected a sky so realistic it was disturbing. The artificial sun hung at what appeared to be late afternoon, casting long shadows that moved in ways that shadows shouldn't move. The landscape rolled away in all directions, a patchwork of different biomes that had been stitched together by someone with a profound understanding of ecosystems and an equally profound disregard for the psychological well-being of anyone who had to live in them. To their left lay what looked like a temperate forest, except the trees were the wrong color, and their branches moved despite the absence of any detectable wind. Straight ahead stretched a rocky desert, dotted with formations that resembled geological features right up until you noticed they were breathing. To their right, a wetland area steamed with mists that glowed faintly purple and seemed to whisper in languages that predated speech. "Bloody hell," Finn breathed. "They've built an entire world in here. Multiple biomes, complete weather systems, and what appears to be a functioning ecosystem that makes my skin crawl just looking at it." Cleo was already pulling out her scanner, a basic military-issue device that could analyze atmospheric conditions, detect life signs, and identify potential hazards. The readings she got back made her pause and check the device twice. "Atmosphere's breathable," she reported, "but there's something off about the chemical composition. Elevated levels of several compounds I can't identify, and the electromagnetic spectrum is unusual." "Unusual how?" Dakota asked. "Like, there's something interfering with normal sensor readings. The scanner keeps picking up life signs and then losing them, as if whatever's out there is specifically designed to avoid detection." Juno had his medical tricorder out, taking readings on their immediate environment. His expression grew increasingly concerned as he studied the results. "The biological activity in this place is off the charts," he said. "I'm detecting genetic markers from dozens of different worlds, but they've been modified, enhanced. Whatever lives in here isn't naturally occurring." A sound drifted across the landscape, low and resonant, like a hunting call from something very large and very far away. It was answered by another call from a different direction, and then another, until the air filled with an harmony that suggested coordination and intelligence. "Right," Dakota said, shouldering her pack and checking her weapon. "Let's find shelter and figure out what we're dealing with before we start running around like tourists." They moved toward the forest biome, reasoning that tree cover would provide both concealment and protection from whatever was making those calls. The ground beneath their feet felt wrong, too soft in some places and too hard in others, as if the very earth was adapting to their presence. Plants rustled as they passed, despite the lack of wind, and Dakota could swear she felt eyes watching them from the shadows. The forest, when they reached it, was like stepping into an alien nightmare disguised as familiar territory. The trees resembled Earth species at first glance, but closer inspection revealed bark that moved like living tissue, and leaves that tracked their movement with disturbing precision. The air smelled of growing things and decay, life and death, mixing in proportions that made breathing feel like a conscious decision. "Motion sensors are going mad," Cleo reported, studying her scanner. "I'm reading movement everywhere, but I can't get a lock on anything specific. It's like the entire forest is alive and trying to avoid being detected." "That's because it probably is," Juno said, kneeling beside a patch of moss that definitely hadn't been there when they'd entered the tree line. "Look at this. The ground cover is reorganizing itself in response to our presence. We're not just being watched. We're being studied." Finn had found a tree to lean against and was examining its bark with the kind of fascination that usually preceded either brilliant discoveries or terrible mistakes. "These aren't trees," he announced. "They're some sort of biological technology. Living computers, maybe, or organic sensors. The whole forest could be one massive organism." A scream echoed across the biodome, high and desperate, and definitely Helixian. It cut off abruptly, replaced by sounds that Dakota really didn't want to think about too carefully. "Well," she said, "that answers the question about how dangerous this place is supposed to be." The ground beneath them trembled slightly, and Dakota realized that the forest was responding to the distress call. Trees shifted position with glacial slowness, creating new pathways and closing off others. The very landscape was adapting, learning, hunting. "We need to move," Cleo said, but her voice was steady despite the circumstances. "Standing still makes us targets, and I have a feeling this place gets more dangerous the longer we stay in one spot." They began working their way deeper into the forest, moving carefully and quietly. Behind them, Dakota could hear the sounds of pursuit, though what was doing the pursuing remained frustratingly unclear. Ahead, the artificial sunlight filtered through leaves that seemed to absorb more light than they reflected, creating pools of shadow that moved independently of their sources. Another scream, this time distinctly Drachmarie, followed by the kind of roaring that suggested something very large had just become very angry. The sound was answered by others, a chorus of predatory calls that seemed to come from every direction at once. "How many species do you think they've put in here?" Juno asked, his medical training making him focus on the tactical implications of whatever was hunting them. "All of them," Finn replied grimly. "Every apex predator, every evolutionary nightmare, every creature that other species tell scary stories about. This isn't a training exercise. It's a zoo, and we're not the visitors." A new sound joined the growing symphony of hunt calls, something that made Dakota's blood freeze in her veins. It was mechanical and organic at the same time, like massive gears grinding against living tissue, punctuated by electronic screeches that hurt to hear. "The Quellans," Cleo said, her face pale. "Whatever got them is using their cybernetics against them." That was when Dakota realized the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just a collection of dangerous predators thrown into an artificial ecosystem. Someone had designed creatures specifically to counter the natural advantages of each species in the Academy. The Helixians' crystal bodies, the Drachmarie pack tactics, the Quellans' technological integration, all of it had been studied, analyzed, and neutralized, which meant that somewhere in this biological nightmare there was something specifically designed to kill humans. The question was, did whoever created this place understand humans well enough to build an effective counter to their capabilities? Or were they about to find out that Earth's apex predators had been underestimated once again? The forest around them grew darker as something very large began moving through the trees, and Dakota had a feeling they were about to get their answer. The thing that emerged from the deeper forest looked like someone had taken a perfectly reasonable predator and run it through a committee of evolutionary biologists who'd been drinking heavily and making poor life choices. It stood roughly 12 feet tall, moved on 6 legs that ended in claws designed for both climbing and disemboweling, and had a head that was mostly teeth, with some sensory organs thrown in as an afterthought. But what made Dakota's skin crawl wasn't its size or its weaponry. It was the way it moved. Deliberate, intelligent, like it was thinking through each step, analyzing their positions, calculating attack vectors with the kind of cold precision that suggested this wasn't just a predator. This was an assassin. "Shadow Maw," Finn breathed, recognizing the creature from the Academy's xenobiology database. Extinct species from the Kepler Rim, supposedly wiped out when their home star went nova, but I guess somebody kept samples. "Extinct for a reason," Juno added, slowly reaching for his medical kit. "Not for supplies, the emergency beacon hidden inside it. These things were designed by evolution to hunt in packs, using coordinated attacks and advanced tactical thinking." "Pack?" Cleo's voice was perfectly steady, which was how Dakota knew she was absolutely terrified. "As in plural?" The shadows around them began moving differently, and Dakota realized they weren't looking at shadows at all. They were looking at more shadow maws, each one positioned to cut off a different escape route. The creatures had surrounded them using a pincer movement that would have made human military tacticians proud and slightly jealous. "Well," Dakota said, checking her sidearm and knowing it would be about as useful as harsh language against creatures that had evolved to hunt starship crews, "this is going to be interesting." The lead Shadow Maw tilted its head, studying them with eyes that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. It made a sound, low and complex, that was clearly communication. The other creatures responded with their own calls, a tactical discussion happening in real time while their prey stood there listening. "They're coordinating," Cleo observed, "discussing strategy. They know we're intelligent, and they're treating us like a tactical problem rather than just food." "Flattering," Finn said, pulling out what looked like a standard-issue multi-tool, but which Dakota knew contained enough jury-rigged electronics to probably hack a small space station. "Though I'd prefer if they underestimated us instead." The Shadow Maws finished their discussion and began moving, not charging but advancing with the kind of patience that suggested they had all the time in the world. Which, Dakota realized, they probably did. This was their territory, their rules, their game. But humans had been playing games with predators for a very long time. "Smoke," she said quietly. Her teammates didn't question the order. Juno pulled out 3 emergency flares from his medical kit, not the kind designed for signaling, but the kind designed for creating thick, choking clouds of chemical smoke that could buy precious seconds in a crisis. Finn activated whatever he'd been building in his multi-tool, creating a high-pitched electronic whine that made the Shadow Maws pause and shake their heads in obvious discomfort. "On my mark," Dakota said, pulling out her own surprise. Not a weapon, but a small mirror she'd salvaged from her quarters. 3, 2, 1, mark. The flares activated simultaneously, filling the forest with dense smoke that turned the world into a gray, choking maze. The Shadow Maws' hunting calls turned to confusion and anger as their primary senses were overloaded. Finn's device added electronic chaos to the mix, disrupting whatever sensory systems the creatures used for coordination. And Dakota used her mirror to redirect the artificial sunlight, creating brief, blinding flashes that left afterimages burned into retinas evolved for hunting in darkness. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't high-tech. It was 3 parts desperation, 2 parts improvisation, and 1 part of the particular kind of stubborn creativity that came from being a species that had survived ice ages, plague, and reality television. It worked. The Shadow Maws stumbled through the smoke, like apex predators suddenly reduced to confused animals, their coordination shattered by sensory overload. The humans moved through the chaos like ghosts, using the creature's size and confusion against them, slipping between legs and around claws with the kind of agility that came from being persistence hunters rather than ambush killers. They broke free of the encirclement and ran. "That," Juno said as they put distance between themselves and the increasingly angry sounds behind them, "was either brilliant or completely insane." "Both," Dakota replied. "Standard human protocol." They'd gained maybe 10 minutes, but the shadow maws wouldn't stay confused forever. Already, Dakota could hear them reorganizing, their hunting calls taking on new patterns that suggested they were adapting. Their tactics, whatever intelligence had designed these creatures, had given them the ability to learn from their mistakes, which meant the same trick wouldn't work twice. The forest gave way to the rocky desert biome, and the change was jarring enough to make them all pause. The temperature jumped by at least 20 degrees, the air became dry and harsh, and the ground beneath their feet turned to something that looked like sand, but felt like it was made of tiny, angry crystals. "Environmental transition zones," Cleo observed, checking her scanner. "They've created borders between biomes that are specifically designed to disorient anyone moving between them. The atmospheric pressure changes, gravity shifts slightly, even the electromagnetic spectrum is different." "Sensory overload by design," Finn agreed. "Someone wanted to make sure that anyone trying to escape from one type of predator would be vulnerable to whatever lives in the next zone." A new sound echoed across the desert, like wind through caverns, if wind could carry malevolent intelligence. Something was moving out there, something large enough to create its own weather patterns. "Void serpent," Juno identified, his medical training including enough xenobiology to recognize creatures that regularly put people in need of medical attention. "Reality-bending constrictors from the Andromeda cluster. They hunt by manipulating local space-time to create confusion and disorientation in their prey." "Of course they do," Dakota muttered, "because regular giant snakes weren't challenging enough." The air around them began to shimmer, and Dakota felt her inner ear rebel as up and down became negotiable concepts. The horizon wavered like heat shimmer, except heat shimmer didn't usually involve the ground occasionally deciding to be perpendicular to where it had been a moment earlier. "Don't trust your eyes," she called out, remembering academy briefings about creatures that weaponized physics. "Use your other senses. Feel for solid ground, listen for real sounds, trust your balance over your vision." Easier said than done when the world kept folding itself into origami patterns that made geometry professors weep. But humans had one advantage that most species lacked when it came to dealing with sensory manipulation. They were already used to not being able to trust reality. Every human spent their childhood learning that adults lied to them about important things, that marketing was designed to manipulate perception, and that their own senses could be fooled by everything from stage magicians to optical illusions. They were, as a species, naturally paranoid about the reliability of sensory input, which meant that when a void serpent started messing with local reality, humans just got annoyed rather than paralyzed. "There," Cleo said, pointing to what looked like empty air, but which her scanner was insisting contained something large and serpentine. "It's using refraction to bend light around itself, but the mass displacement is showing up on gravitometric readings." "Can you track it?" Dakota asked. "Better than that," Finn said, his jury-rigged electronics now producing a different kind of signal. "I can jam its reality manipulation field. Not permanently, but long enough to make it visible." The air solidified, revealing a creature that was somehow worse when visible than when hidden. The void serpent was easily 60 feet long, covered in scales that seemed to absorb light, and had a head that looked like someone had crossed a cobra with a black hole. Its eyes weren't just black. They were absence, voids in space-time that hurt to look at directly. But now that they could see it, they could fight it. Overload, Dakota said, understanding immediately what needed to happen. If it manipulates reality through sensory input, we give it too much input to process. They spread out, each human becoming a source of chaotic sensory data. Finn's electronics shrieked across multiple frequencies. Juno's medical equipment activated every alarm and beacon it contained. Cleo's scanner began broadcasting false readings on every spectrum it could access. Dakota pulled out emergency flares, her mirror, and started making as much noise as possible. The Void Serpent recoiled, its reality manipulation field wavering as it tried to process too much conflicting information. Its scales rippled with confusion, and for a moment, the desert around them snapped back to normal physics. That was when they struck, not with weapons, but with the kind of coordinated harassment that had made humans the galaxy's most annoying species. They attacked its senses, its concentration, its ability to focus on any single target long enough to bring its reality-bending abilities to bear. The Serpent thrashed, trying to escape the sensory chaos, but every time it tried to bend space-time, one of them would hit it with another burst of electronic noise, or reflected light, or some new form of sensory assault. It was like trying to concentrate on advanced mathematics while being attacked by a marching band having an argument with a construction site. Eventually, the creature gave up and retreated deeper into the desert, its reality manipulation field collapsing entirely as it fled. "That," Juno said, watching the Serpent disappear into the distance, "should not have worked." "No," Cleo agreed, "it really shouldn't have. Void Serpents are supposed to be nearly impossible to defeat without heavy weapons and reality stabilizers. Unless," Finn said thoughtfully, "you're dealing with a species that's naturally resistant to sensory manipulation because they've spent millennia learning not to trust anything their senses tell them." Dakota was about to respond when a new sound echoed across the biodome, deeper and more terrifying than anything they'd heard so far. It was mechanical and organic, electronic and primal. The sound of something that had been built rather than evolved, but had learned to hate with the passion of a living thing. The artificial sun dimmed, and emergency lighting activated around the dome's perimeter. Warning signals began broadcasting in multiple languages, all saying the same thing: containment breach, evacuation protocols activated, all personnel to emergency stations immediately. "That's not supposed to be here," Cleo said, her scanner detecting energy signatures that made it emit sounds of electronic distress. Whatever that is, it wasn't part of the planned exercise. Through the transparent dome ceiling, Dakota could see Academy personnel running for emergency shuttles. Some of them were carrying weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat, the kind of firepower normally reserved for planetary invasions. "World Ender," Finn breathed, recognizing the energy signature from Academy databases that were supposed to be classified. "They've got a bloody World Ender in here with us." World Enders were the stuff of military nightmares, bioweapons designed by a long-extinct species for the specific purpose of ending civilizations. They were intelligent, adaptive, nearly indestructible, and possessed a hatred for all organic life that burned with the intensity of a dying star. Only 3 had ever been encountered in galactic history, and each one had required the combined firepower of multiple fleets to destroy. And now there was one loose in the biodome, with nothing between it and them except some very inadequate barriers that were apparently failing. "Right," Dakota said, watching Academy personnel evacuate with the kind of speed that suggested they knew exactly how dangerous their situation had become. New plan. Forget about surviving the exercise. Let's focus on surviving the next hour. But as the containment barriers collapsed, and something vast and terrible began moving through the biodome, Dakota realized that an hour might be optimistic. The arena was about to become a slaughterhouse, and they were the only ones left inside with the butcher. The World Ender emerged from the biodome's central containment facility like a nightmare given physical form and a really bad attitude about the whole existing in the same universe as other life forms situation. It stood 30 feet tall, moved on legs that looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought regular legs weren't nearly intimidating enough, and radiated the kind of malevolent intelligence that made survival instincts scream and rational thought pack up and leave town. But what made Dakota's blood run cold wasn't its size or its obvious capacity for violence. It was the way it paused after breaking free, tilted its massive head, and began systematically hunting down the surviving alien cadets with the methodical precision of someone working through a grocery list. It's not just killing them, she realized, watching the creature corner a group of Drachmori who'd managed to survive their encounter with the shadow maws. It's studying them, learning how each species fights, how they think, how they die. The Drachmori pack tried their coordinated assault tactics, moving with the fluid precision of born hunters. The World Ender let them attack, absorbed their claws and energy weapons without apparent damage, then systematically dismantled their formation with surgical strikes that targeted each individual's specific weaknesses. Adaptive combat protocols, Finn said grimly, his electronics detecting the massive processing power the creature was bringing to bear. It's running real-time analysis on every opponent, building tactical profiles, learning from each encounter. Which means, Cleo added, by the time it gets to us, it will have learned everything there is to know about how galactic species fight. Good thing we're not really a galactic species then, Juno said, checking his medical supplies and looking surprisingly calm for someone facing down a civilization-ending bioweapon. We're just the weird neighbors who moved in recently and haven't figured out how things work around here. The World Ender finished with the Drachmori and turned its attention to the few surviving Quellans who were trying to coordinate a technological solution using their cybernetic implants. The creature studied their approach for exactly 38 seconds, then released some kind of electromagnetic pulse that turned their advanced technology into expensive jewelry. Right, Dakota said, shouldering her pack and checking her remaining supplies. New plan. We don't fight this thing using conventional tactics, because conventional tactics are exactly what it's designed to counter. What do you suggest? Finn asked. We do what humans do best. We cheat, we improvise, and we make it up as we go along. The World Ender had finished studying the other species and was now moving in their direction, with the inexorable patience of something that had all the time in the universe. Its massive footsteps shook the ground, and Dakota could feel the weight of its attention settling on them like a physical force. It's analyzing us, Cleo reported, watching her scanner readings, trying to categorize our threat level, our probable tactics, our species-specific capabilities. Let's give it something to analyze, Dakota said. What followed was less a battle and more a masterclass in why humans had survived ice ages, predators, and each other for millions of years. They didn't fight the World Ender. They annoyed it, confused it, and made its existence as complicated as possible. Finn jury-rigged the biodome's own systems against it, turning environmental controls into weapons and using the creature's massive size against it in spaces designed for much smaller beings. Juno deployed every medical emergency beacon he had, creating a cacophony of distress signals that overloaded the creature's sensory processing. Cleo mapped its movement patterns and predicted its responses, staying one step ahead of its adaptive algorithms. And Dakota? Dakota did what human leaders had been doing since the species first figured out that sometimes the best way to win was to make sure everyone else survived to fight another day. When the other surviving cadets, Helixians, Quellins, even a few Drachmori, found themselves cornered by the creature's systematic hunt, the humans didn't abandon them. They intervened, drawing the World Ender's attention, giving the aliens time to escape. "Why?" gasped Helix, the crystal-skinned cadet staring at Dakota in confusion. "We are competitors, rivals. Why risk yourselves for us?" "Because," Dakota said, throwing another improvised distraction at the approaching bioweapon, "that's what humans do. We protect the pack, even when the pack doesn't particularly like us." The final confrontation came when the World Ender, frustrated by their unconventional tactics and inability to categorize them properly, decided to end the problem by destroying the entire biodome. Its weapons began charging, preparing to turn the artificial ecosystem into plasma. That was when Dakota realized the solution wasn't defeating the creature. It was turning the arena's own ecosystem against it. "The other predators," she called out to her team. "They're still in here, still territorial, still programmed to defend their hunting grounds." Understanding flashed across her teammates' faces. They scattered across the biodome, using everything they'd learned about each biome's apex predators to drive them toward the World Ender. Shadow maws emerging from the forests, void serpents rising from the desert, creatures from the wetlands that didn't have names in any living language. The World Ender found itself facing not one tactical problem, but dozens, each creature fighting with the desperate fury of something defending its territory. While it tried to adapt to multiple simultaneous threats, the humans coordinated the chaos, turning the arena into a massive trap. When Academy reinforcements finally arrived, they found the biodome's ecosystem in ruins, most of the predators dead or dying, and the World Ender trapped under the wreckage of its own containment facility, finally defeated by the combined efforts of every species it had tried to destroy. Commander Thane stood in the aftermath, staring at four humans who had somehow managed to save not just themselves, but every other survivor in the arena. "Cadets," he said finally, "I believe we need to reconsider some of our assumptions about your species." Dakota looked around at her teammates, then at the mixed group of alien survivors they'd protected, and smiled. "Commander, I think that's the point. We're not what anyone expects us to be. We're just human." And for the first time since joining the Academy, that felt like more than enough.